space-time, and therefore truths about the metal as well. So, but these two metaphysical theses that I reject, theses concerning the relation between the mental and the physical, substance dualism and property dualism so defined, are both consistent with my odd ideas about the relation between the mental and the physical. Now my very odd ideas about causation. And these ideas can be summed up in just a few words. Causal relations exist, many of them are instantiated. Causal explanations exist and are sometimes correct. Causation does not exist. But perhaps this summary does not wear its sense on its sleeve. Perhaps these words require some kind of commentary or gloss. I will try to provide it. So let's start with causal relations exist, but causation does not exist. Causal relations, as I see matters, are relations that hold not between events, but between substances. They are relations that are expressed by verbs like push, press, kiss, and so on. Even if you took the disjunction of them all, what would you call it? Influences, effects, acts on, has an effect on. It would still be a relation that held between and only between substances. This, then, is what I mean by saying that causation does not exist. There is no relation whose properties in any way resemble the properties that philosophers talking about causation ascribe to that relation. Now, to a certain extent, I admit, the wording of my thesis, causation does not exist, was chosen for dramatic effect. We might distinguish causation, the relation, from causation, the phenomenon. The phenomenon of causation consists simply in the fact that things act on other things. Shoppers carry parcels. Sunlight warms stones. Falling water turns water wheels. Children annoy their parents. But, I contend, causation, the phenomenon, is not identical with, is not reducible to, does not supervene on the holding or not holding of a relation called causation between the members of each pair of events. Indeed, its reality is consistent with there being no such thing as events at all. I should say, too, that my thesis does not imply that if someone engaged in the ordinary business of life says her death was caused by a traffic accident, then that person says something false. It does imply that the truth of that person's assertion does not entail that the words her death denote an item that stands in a relation expressed by X was caused by Y to an item that belongs to the extension of X is a traffic accident. Nor, I maintain, does a piece of discourse like, Mrs. White, Detective O'Malley and I are just a little unclear about the order in which things happened. We'd like you to describe carefully the sequence of events that led up to your husband's death. Presuppose that, in addition to substances, attributes, and relation, there are objects that are the acquisitions of attributes by substance, or the, as you might call them, comings to stand in relations by pluralities of substances. When Mrs. White says, well, my husband came through the door and then he tripped over the dog and hit his head on the corner of the kitchen table, her statement does not imply, at any rate it need not be taken to imply, that there are objects that are the reference of phrases like, my husband's coming through the door and my husband's tripping over the dog. And why do I say that there's no such relation as causation? Well, one reason, of course, is that my ontology implies that there are no events, and thus no objects of the sort that that relation requires as its terms. But if there were good accounts of the phenomenon of causation that identified it with the pattern of instantiation of a relation that holds only between events, and which, as part and parcel of that task, presented us with a logically serviceable account of the ontology of events, I'd certainly want to modify my ontology to include events. But I have not been impressed by the attempts of a vast army of very able philosophers either to define causation, which seems to lead only to ever more elaborate epicycles, or to provide an ontology of events. I want to suggest a way to understand our causal discourse that does not presuppose that there is such a relation as causation. I propose to understand our discourse in terms of causal explanations, for I say that causal explanations exist. That is to say, people explain things, and causal relations, pushing, pulling, kicking, hitting, kissing, play a central and essential role in some of these explanations, particularly in the explanations of contingent states of affairs. Sometimes our causal explanations are achronic, like this one, essentially Aristotle's, of why the Earth is a ball. Well, if it weren't a ball, the force of gravity would immediately pull it into that shape. Newton's explanation of why the planets move in elliptical orbits with the sun at one focus is also an achronic causal explanation. Achronic explanations provide answers to why questions. Why is the Earth a ball? Why do the planets move in elliptical orbits? Or even, why does the car make that funny wah, wah, wah noise when it goes over 40? Of course, the car is making that funny noise is no doubt a very temporary state of affairs, even in relation to the life of the car. I call an explanation like a strut is out of alignment, achronic, to call attention to the fact that the state of affairs cited in the explanandum obtains simultaneously with the state of affairs that is the explanandum and, as it were, underlies it. Other causal explanations, however, take the form of stories or histories or narratives. Such explanations are generally more easily thought of as answers to questions that begin with how rather than with why. Questions, for example, like how did Winifred die? Or how did the lion escape from its cage? Or how did that strut you say is out of alignment get out of alignment? It is causal explanations of this latter sort, causal narratives, I call them, that I am primarily interested in today. Causal narratives are answers to questions of this general sort. The so-and-so has the property F, or the so-and-sos now stand in the relation R. How did that happen? How did things get to be that way? That is to say, someone observes that things have changed. A certain object now has a certain property, or a certain relation now holds among certain objects, and that person asks why things are now that way when they didn't used to be. And typically, almost always, the answer to such questions will consist in a description of how those current properties of and those relations that now hold among various objects are a consequence of how those objects, and perhaps some other objects, have acted on one another. In some of the simpler cases, cases involving objects like billiard balls, the answer will consist in a description of how things have moved and have been moved, how they have pushed one another and have been pushed by one another. Causal narratives contain and depend essentially on causal verbs, the verbs like push, pull, strike, and turn, and kiss, and annoy, and comfort, and kill. I want to make a few remarks about the logic of causal verbs. We may distinguish causal verbs, which are typically transitive verbs, from verbs of change. Verbs like move, break, become warmer, and grow angry, all of them intransitive. Of course, we have to note that in English and many other natural languages, the, as you might say, same verb may be transitive or intransitive depending on context. Aristotle's hand moved the staff. First one is intransitive, second one transitive. And now I'm going to simply to paraphrase what comes, I'm not going to talk about this C operator that's discussed here. I'll simply say that in our causal discourse, I think we need one other ingredient than these causal verbs. We need a sentential connective, a binary sentential connective, non-truth functional, that binds sentences together. One way to read it would be because, P because Q. Or you might say P as a result of Q, or it came to pass that Q, thereby causing it to be the case that P. There will be lots of ways to phrase it, but remember this isn't whether the word cause occurs in this phrase at all, it's a sentential connective and it doesn't express some relation that holds between objects. All we need for our causal narratives is a sufficient stock of verbs, of causal verbs, and all we need that pertains to the phenomenon of causation is a sufficient stock of causal verbs and this sentential connective. So now we can say things like the billiard ball A hit billiard ball B, thereby causing billiard ball B to move, thereby causing being another way to express this sentential connective. Okay, finally, bringing it all together. I want to bring together everything I've said about ontology, the metal, and causation by considering the relation between two kinds of causal narratives. Causal narratives are history, largely imaginary,